Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Decoupling Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Kennedy. I'm the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm delighted to invite you today to this terrific roundtable discussion about Xi Jinping's common prosperity drive. Is it the path to common prosperity or a path to common poverty? To help me and all of you understand where China is going in ways big and small, we have three fantastic leading experts with us to break all of this down. From New York and JP Morgan, we have Joyce Chang. She's the Managing Director and Chair of Global Research with JP Morgan. Joyce is one of the smartest people to be able to analyze China's economy, what's going on in the financial sector, China's economic connectivity with the rest of the world. Really wish that I had some money with JP Morgan so that I could benefit from her advice every single day. But I only get to talk to her a few times a year, and so this is really a fantastic treat for me. Joining us from Points West is Scott Rozelle. He's the Helen F. Farnsworth Senior Fellow and Co-Director of Stanford's China Center for China's Economy and Institutions. I should know that because we are collaborating on a lot of cool stuff. And he's been at Stanford for several years. He is one of the world's leading experts on rural China, Chinese agriculture, education, issues of equity. And if there's anyone who can talk about common prosperity or poverty, it's Scott Rozelle. Also joining us today is John Holden, who is the Senior Director for the China Practice at McLarty Associates. He's also, hopefully not to his detriment, a non-resident senior associate with our program here at CSIS and is a mentor to me. He was former chairman of AmCham China, ran multiple businesses in China, was president of the U.S. China Business Council, and is a great friend. And he's joining us today, I believe, from the great state of Arizona, where I believe it's most likely a little bit warmer than here in Washington, D.C. Joyce, Scott, and John, thank you all for being with us today. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time giving background information about this policy of common prosperity, other than just to say, I think people are really confused about what this is. Is this Xi Jinping angry at Jack Ma and therefore taking it out on private businesses and putting them in their place? Is this really an effort to launch a new progressive era in China, where we are trying to where they really are trying to limit the power of big business in the same way that, say, progressives in the United States or Europe would try to do, and bring more equality and fairness to the economy? Is this Cultural Revolution 2.0, where China is going back 50 years, from which it will not emerge in very good shape? Or is there something about this that no one is talking about that we really need to understand? I think that the fact that we can't travel to China is one reason we're confused. The other is just, I need to get a lot more smart on this. And you all are going to help me and everyone who's watching today. So I really just want to start first with this round robin here with Joyce, Scott, and John. What is this all about? What is the motives or intention of this drive towards common prosperity from your vantage point? Joyce, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Scott. And it's great to be here with Scott and with John. And also just wanted to say I appreciate so much the work that CSIS is doing as we are looking at all of these issues related to tech, the cyber war, climate change. But common prosperity is not new. It is an essential part of socialism, and it has been around since 1949, taking different iterations under different leaders. So you had first Chairman Mao, where it was all about eliminating the private and individual economy. That was a failure. Then you had Deng Xiaoping starting on reform and opening up China globally in the 1980s, really with a goal to eliminate poverty. And now you have the current iteration that really started under President Hu Jintao, and that was about developing a more people-oriented, scientific approach. And you see that in the common prosperity language today that talks about the green economy and innovation, the new economy. Now, this really was strengthened under President Xi Jinping, who has focused on the whole issue of inequality and basically income inequality and ways in which he can redistribute this. Many of these goals, they say, are ones that they have in place until 2035, 2049. So this is not going away anytime soon. But what does common prosperity mean? So I think there's three different aspects that I would just focus on right now. First of all, it really is focused on the new economy sectors. And we saw this with a lot of the financial regulatory tightening. And China has a history of doing this. Many sectors that expanded early and fast, whether it was telecom, shipping, banking, went through this historically. So where they had basically said they want to control the amount of profitability, put more regulation in. The second part of it, though, really is focused on the middle class in China and the fact that disposable income is still very limited when you look at the cost of housing and transportation and education. So there has been a focus on consumer welfare and social welfare. And the third aspect of it, which we see playing out this week when we look at what's happening in the commodities markets, is the green economy and the decarbonization goals. So these are longer term goals. This is actually not a new approach in China. It's taken many forms of different iteration. And I think that what investors will really need to worry about going forward is it's not just the economic risk that they need to watch. They're also going to have to really watch the policy risk. And I think that's what the markets are grappling with right now as they see these measures rolled out. I don't think that we're done with the regulatory tightening. I think that there's still more to come. And I would emphasize that these are longer term goals that will play out over many years. But I think common prosperity is certainly nothing new. It is an essential element of socialism.
Thank you. That's really helpful. That provides a clear analytical framework to think about this. Scott, you follow issues of equity and prosperity a lot. Your book, Invisible China, pointed to places where there wasn't the type of equities and goals achieved that people had wanted. How do you see what China is trying to do now?
Well, I was just, you saw me, I was taking notes, Joyce, and I thought that was because I think this is totally new and potentially totally new. But I think we have absolutely no idea where it's going at because it's been, I call this the summer of 2021's, explosion of new policy objectives, right? From data and security to de-risking to raising the birth rate to rebuilding decentralized cities, carbon emissions that Joyce talked about, and common prosperity. It's like one long breath, and all of these ends, right? And right, if we hit them by 2049, China would be in great shape. The trouble is I don't know where, if we look at the instruments that have been used so far for these policy goals, is it's this sort of hodgepodge of these, we want to increase birth rates, so we're going to cut down cram schools, right? We're going to We're going to try to reduce carbon emissions, right? So we raise coal power, the price of coal, and the power gets shut off. And what, common prosperity, right? I'm not sure exactly, what they're going to do. So I think that so far the traditional levers, we haven't even heard them talk about. Now, maybe Joyce is right, and I think that's the thing that I hear and take away from what you just said, Joyce. But it's early. It's a long run process. So, are they going to roll out? We haven't heard the word taxes, right? We haven't heard the word. How about raising investments into human capital? That I'm going to talk about a little later. I don't want to get into it now, but I think that's where we're at. This common prosperity is so new. We don't even know, what they mean. Certainly, if we had the richest 50 million people in China give away half their wealth. Yes, the middle class is doing pretty well, Joyce, even though they have a belt tightening. But the middle class is only 300 million people. The low class, there's no poverty in China, right? But the low income class is 1.1 billion people. 1.1 billion people are low income. If we took all the philanthropy, this has been the only common prosperity instruments, we're going to raise income of the lower class by 7%. So we have a long ways to go before we see where China's really going on this.
John Holden, you've watched China for many years. You started watching China during the first period that Joyce referred to, during the Mao period. You saw all of the Deng period and the later Hu period, and now with Xi, more continuity than change, old wine, new bottles, or is this really something pretty new? I'm trying to find every analogy I can to confuse the audience, so help us figure this out.
Well, thanks, Scott. I think that Joyce is absolutely right to refer back to 1949 and the original intent of the CCP. This is something that Xi Jinping has been talking about a lot recently. And I just want to recount an anecdote that'll put this into perspective a little bit for us. 20 years ago, I visited Shanghai. This was, by the way, I was not the U.S.-China Business Council. I was president of the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations. And when I first took that job, I visited Shanghai to visit Wang Daohan, who was the former mayor of Shanghai and was an advisor to Jiang Zemin. And we had a fascinating discussion. And I said, well, it's really hard to understand what Chinese leaders think about the future of their country. He said, in your hotel room tonight, there will be my answer to your question. The answer was a 5-volume history of the rise and fall of the Soviet Union and key strategic decisions. So this is a backdrop to think about. And we asked the question, well, is common prosperity, is it trying to align with the people in order to bolster Xi Jinping's political chances? Yes, to some extent, but not really. It's really to align the goals of China with the Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and these 2035 and 2049 goals. So that's all very important. I think Scott's pointed to some of the disruptive dimensions of what's happening today, and I think that's absolutely right. They are responding with sharp actions to deal with what we can only presume are major problems. And, I'm reminded of Wen Jiabao back in 2007 when he said, China's economy is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. To a large extent, they haven't resolved these problems, and they're still wrestling with how to recalibrate the relationship between the state and the market. And at the end of the day, what is this about? Well, to some extent, this is really about political control. If you have a class of gazillionaires around, flying around the world, who may have no allegiance to you, this is a potential problem. And I think back on the fact that Xi Jinping is the first Chinese leader since Deng who was not selected by Deng. He had to compete in an atmosphere, and so his sense of his own security is something that he has to think about constantly. And so eliminating sources of political rivalry, people who may have a different agenda, is important. Certainly, the Chinese tech elite are not going to be talking about common prosperity unless they're told to do so.
So that's super helpful. By the way, I'm sorry, confusing institutions. Oftentimes now I don't even know where my glasses are when they're sitting on my head. So my team can confirm that. So apologies. You know, I guess what I can conclude from what the three of you have said is that to call this a policy or a rectification effort or a campaign or an attack on high tech or any one thing is not enough, that this is bigger, right? It echoes in the past. It may rhyme with some other policies or be a slight change of tactic, but it's very large. And we should not try to minimize the shift that's ongoing. I think that's at least a commonality I hear amongst all of you. And so I think that's very important because we can't understate how important this is, even if we still are trying to define the four corners of it. So I think we've made progress there. Joyce, let me ask on the economics of this. Let's say the broad outlines of the different policies from the state administration of market regulation, the CSRC, the NDRC, and others are roughly kind of what they are doing now. What are you all predicting in terms of the effect on growth trajectory for the next 12 months, or where China is going? And then let's if we just add to that a clause, they take Scott Rozell's policy ideas, because I'm going to come back to ask him about, say they add on taxes and things like that. What would the delta on growth be there? I don't like to use the word delta too often these days, not because of airlines, because of something else. But what would the delta be on if they decided to do add taxes to the mix?
No, thanks so much, Scott, for that. So we are seeing a slowdown in the China economy. And if we look at third quarter growth, just quarter on quarter, we have it at only 0.2%, so a very sharp slowdown. Now, part of that is the Delta variant and a drop in consumption. But the financial tightening, the property market is definitely having an impact as well. And we still have the overall headline growth in China, north of 8% this year, going to 5.5% next year. But the property market is big, and from a macro perspective, the housing sector is a key pillar of the Chinese economy. It contributes about 15% of GDP. The real estate investment alone accounts for about 25% of fixed investment. So if you think about a 5 percentage point slowdown in real estate investment, that actually takes about 0.4% off of GDP growth in China. And if you look at the indirect effect, and you take that all into account, it's about 0.7% off of growth. So this is going to have a very significant impact. And you'd already had financial tightening in other sectors. But let's just take a look at everything that China has announced since the beginning of the year. And I think Scott and John both make some great points that some of this is very new. But the key thing is that this administration does not seem to think that market outcomes alone will achieve common prosperity. So they've intervened. But let's look at what they've done just since the beginning of 2021. So first, they started the year by outlining red lines for development, the ban on mining and cryptocurrency, the launch of a central bank digital currency and development of a central bank digital currency, a carbon neutral target, the launch of carbon trading, a national medicine procurement policy. They closed for-profit K through 12. They launched the Beijing Securities Exchange, and then common prosperity, and now the Evergrande saga. So that's all just since the start of this year. So this does have longer term implications, much beyond looking at just what's happening with quarterly growth in China. It means that they are going to take some short-term pain for longer-term gain. That's what common prosperity is about. And basically a view that market outcomes alone are not going to be enough to achieve the kind of equality they want to achieve. Now, I think Scott makes a great point. They've done very little on things like taxes and real income distribution. So will we see this? Will we actually see property taxes? Will we see greater pressure by companies to raise wages? And you're already seeing a number of Chinese companies, much as we've seen in the US, in advance start to announce, oh, here are our common prosperity targets. We're committing 100 billion yuan to common prosperity. So I think these kinds of redistribution mechanisms that we haven't seen before are new. But they're all in the name of how do we achieve better equality. So the first step was getting the population out of poverty. The second step is that the middle income still, their disposable income is still very small because of the cost of housing, transportation, education, healthcare. So a sense that this is only going to be about property or only about the new economy, it's going to affect all sectors that have to do with social welfare. And I think the key thing is that disposable income and the targets they have for urban disposable income, are 10-year targets that they're still very far from, even though they have really done an extraordinary job of lifting the population out of the levels of poverty that had really been in place before they began many of the reforms under Deng Xiaoping. So I think this has further ramifications. We see growth coming down in China to about 5.5% next year. I think the demographics also point to growth coming down even lower than that in the years that lie ahead, and that has global ramifications. We estimate that every 1 percentage point decline in China's growth takes about 0.5% off of global growth, and it's even more than that for many of the emerging markets countries that are commodity exporters. For Latin America, it's practically a 1-to-1 correlation. So I think that we should expect to see more financial tightening to come, given the nature of these goals. What they have announced, there are some very new things in it, but I think what is very clear is that this inequality that they want to address, we're going to see some policies we haven't seen that do relate to property taxes, income taxes, and also to pressure for higher wages on the part of companies.
Hey, Joyce, I'm going to ask you to do double duty because you said something, you hinted at Evergrande. So I need you to, we're not going to do a real estate event. So just like the big take home, they're going to cauterize the Evergrande problem and spend a lot of money doing so, and have folks break up the company in little bits and pieces across the country, or is your estimate that you just gave us assume that, or does it leave open the possibility that there are other real estate companies that go in harm's way and this spreads?
I think there is going to be more stress on the overall property development sector, but let me just go through some of the numbers. First of all, we do not think that this is a systemic risk to the overall financial system in China. Property developer loans are only about 7% of total loans, but about 40% of bank loans are collateralized by properties, including mortgages. But we've taken a look at a couple of things, such as the total size of Evergrande's debt is the equivalent of about 1.2 trillion CNY. That's about 41 basis points in total credits in China. And if you look at the loan losses for the first half of the year that the banking system was holding, it was 340 basis points for loan losses versus the 41 basis points for the total debt. So I don't see this as systemic. That's the first thing that I would say. But just given the size of the property sector, given the size of the housing market, we are going to see more pressure, come about in China right now, and we are expecting that national sales, land sales, that you could have a 15 to 20% decline, for the developers. So I don't think that this is over yet, and we have to look at what is surprising and what's not surprising. So it's not surprising that they've allowed more corporate defaults. This had been something that was in place. What is surprising is the size of this one. This is, one of the largest borrowers, the biggest non-investment grade issuer in the offshore China corporate dollar bond market. I do think it's going to be a state-guided solution recession, just given the size of this problem. I don't think it's going to be systemic, and I do think that China's going to have to take some macro steps as well to address the slowdown that they've seen in growth and the effects of this tightening. So we do think that they're going to do more RRR cuts in October, more policy rate cuts to come, and we do see a slowdown, that had already been in place even before many of these tightening measures and before Evergrande had been announced. So I think you have to be prepared for the market volatility to to stay with us for quite a bit of time.
That's super helpful. That's super helpful. I've now moved my financial situation from proletariat to proletariat, but it's good for me to know, given all the folks that I have to talk to and everything. Professor Roselle, you mentioned human capital, other steps that one is trying to promote economic development broadly, widely shared amongst that 1.1 billion people of the 1.4 billion in China. What is Common Prosperity doing right so far that you would think that this could potentially address those 1.1 billion people? What additional things that you would make a big difference?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And this, I think it does follow just on what Joyce was saying. In that they, over time since Deng Xiaoping, that's what's taken the 1.1 billion people from below the poverty line, or there's 600 or 700 million, and raised them above the poverty line. But it was it was the market reforms and decollectivization in the 1980s. It was opening of the off-farm labor markets in the 1990s. It was WTO and the expansion of trade in the 2000. By the time we got to 2014, you remember, poverty went from 700 million to 680 million, right? And the last 20 million is what's happened there, and it's been driven largely by rising access to off-farm markets and rising wage rates. Okay, my colleague here at Stanford, Hoonbin Lee, wrote a paper, "The End of Cheap Wages," and it's the end of those cheap wages right through 2013, 2014 that really eliminated all this poverty. It was market-driven, reforms that did this. The last 20 million, yes, it was handing out bags of cash to the handicapped and to the elderly without their kids, right? So, which is good, right? It's a good thing. So, where are we now? And are we ready to launch the second? In fact, the trends are going exactly opposite. Because of rising wages, right? We've had firms move out of China, and we've had enormous automation in the manufacturing session. Employment in manufacturing is falling, right? Employment in construction is falling, right? As they built all the roads, and now we're left with a very, very rapidly expanding low-skilled, no-skill labor service sector, and like what Joyce just said, nobody has the money left over to buy those services, or and wages growth rates and overall wages are falling in that sector. So this, it's 1.1 with the 500 million, 600 million people in this low skill sector. I think you look forward and say, where are they going to be 10 years from now? And then you say, okay, that it doesn't look good. Well, maybe that's what triggered Common Prosperity. Okay, so what's going to solve it? Well, if China does become this high income, high tech, high skill economy, there's only two ways to solve it. Okay, and one is these people without skills in this high, you have to keep transferring bags of cash to them. I mean, you need 100 million people in the low skill service sector, but you don't need 600 million. Or you have to educate this sector. And guess what, right? You start educating people right now at 0 to 3, at 4 to 6, at 6 to 15, and they're going to be ready to enter this sector in 2035, and they're going to get a job in 2035, 2040. And I think that's great. We can hold on, we can go through, but guess what? There's almost no effort. There's very, very little effort to improve rural education, to improve rural health. China is one of the only middle-income countries in the world without a 0 to 3 parental training session, and this is where we're at. So I don't see the effort focused in the right way. If we want common prosperity, there's only really one long-term way to do it, and that's your whole population needs human capital. But you know, you've heard me say this, Scott. If you compare China, a middle-income country, to all the other middle-income countries in the world, guess what? China is number one. It has the lowest level of human capital in the entire middle-income world. Number one, low. And that's measured with this OECD as the share of the labor force that's been to high school. And you know, that this isn't a problem that's solved in 20, it's a problem that's solved in 40 years. And it has to start now, but I haven't seen the commitment to that. And so that's what I'm standing by for. So I think common prosperity for all is a long way off, and I don't think that the current government understands what common prosperity in a high-income, high-tech economy really depends on.
Scott, I'm going to turn to John next, but just as a parenthetical here, is you've written about this, done research on this for a long time. Is this essentially just a political choice of some elements to address that problem in rural China? Is basically a political choice, that it's not, those folks aren't in Xi Jinping's coalition for ruling? Is there a downside to China doing that? Is it because it disfavors the urban elite, or what's the political calculus that says, let's not spend that money there, let's spend it on electric vehicles and AI?
Sure. Because I think it never was I think what people in China, the political economic leadership doesn't realize is economic development from poverty to high income is 2 different phases. One, you go from poor to middle income. And guess what? China did that perfect. Right? They put everybody into primary school. They made them literate, numerate, and gave them great discipline. And they become great factory workers. Right? But it's that second phase. Why is it that 100 countries in the world are stuck in the middle income trap? And in the past 60 years, only 15 of them have graduated. And those 15 of them, they did crazy things like, when their women were in factories, you know, sewing textiles for 12 hours every day, they made them go to high school at night. That's what South Korea did, right? And Taiwan had everyone going to high school, to academic high school, with a lot of American aid, right? And et cetera. But those are the countries that did that. And so I think that they just didn't understand that this second phase of development is really different than the first phase of development. And again, I know China has already said we've already escaped the middle income trap. I actually don't think that that's true. And I hope it is. I mean, I think we're going to touch just a little about what are the implications, but I think that we need to really worry about that.
John, let me ask about China and the global economy and multinationals. I mean, you advise a lot of companies who've worked in China. So I guess from a couple perspectives, what are your clients asking about? What are they most curious about with this transition the last year? Do you provide reassurance to them? Do you highlight the risks that Joyce mentioned at the very beginning, because there's these policy risks? You know, I've not yet seen, you know, protests in front of McDonald's or Starbucks or other symbols of American capitalism be paraded, or massive boycotts of folks, you know, smashing iPhones in favor of Xiaomi's or something like that. What are multinationals worried about? What are you telling them they should be worried about?
Thanks, Scott. Well, definitely American companies in China are not the source of the tremendous strains that the country is under today. And I think Scott is absolutely right to refer to the middle income trap. This is something that I'm absolutely convinced is of deep concern to policymakers and thinkers and analysts in China. It is very, very difficult. If you look at all the secular slowdown in the Chinese economy over the past decade or more, there are fundamental economic reasons why that's happening. And you can't just snap your fingers and get back to 10% growth. And if you don't have growth, who are you taxing? What are you taxing to redistribute income? And I worry about this. You say, well, okay, people are sitting on a lot of wealth in their homes, but taxing people on that to take something away from them that they already have is not going to be very popular. It's very difficult to do these kinds of redistribution. So I think that the challenges that China faces going forward are actually pretty severe. And to some extent, I would even say that this discussion about common prosperity makes a virtue of necessity, in the sense that you have to go there to break free. And so there's going to have to be an awful lot of teaching and propaganda about the importance of doing this in order for the measures that will address the problem to actually take hold. But getting to your question, Scott, I think foreign businesses, and we advise not just American companies, but foreign businesses have been doing relatively well in China. They're profitable, and they're serving the Chinese market. They're there, and they see that their businesses and services are filling a need. Are they concerned about what China's economy may look like 3 to 5 years from now? Yes, but these are kind of dark holes that you can't really base a business on. So people are sticking to their business plans. The things that they do worry about, however, have to do with a sort of closing down of public discourse and the potential for a sort of nationalism or populism to erupt from time to time against foreign players. And in the cases of expatriates, we've seen surveys that show a lot of people are reluctant to go to China at the moment because of what's happened to the two Michaels, the Canadians. And so people are concerned about these kinds of things. They're concerned about changes in Hong Kong, the national security law and the anti-sanctions law, and they see China evolving in ways that give the state power over every aspect of their operations, including their personal safety. So these are the kinds of things that people are concerned about. And they're concerned about China's relationships with other countries, of course, including the United States, which are not in good shape. And then lastly, I would say one thing that is being raised increasingly by people: is there a risk of a war over Taiwan? That is something that people are asking. And there's concern about that.
So that's helpful. So it sounds like this is a big policy or a big change of direction with a whole lot of new policies that folks are still trying to understand. But there are other big questions just about China's political direction, nationalism, war and peace that are as equally important for multinationals to weigh. So this isn't yet the single thing that folks are saying, I need 1 week of your time, John, to educate me on this one thing. It's still amongst a group of things, it sounds like.
And it's right, and it's a work in progress. These are early days to understand how much of these policies and new initiatives will actually become, will the gears mesh and move forward, and how much of them will simply remain aspirational.
I'm going to draw now from some of the questions that are coming in. For those of you who are watching now, you can go to the event webpage and type in your questions. They're being forwarded to me. I'm garbling and mangling them and turning them into things that folks don't understand to make this funner. I'm actually asking what's being coming in. So let me go to one question, which is, and I'll start with Joyce, but I think all of you have a way to chime in here, which is, because Joyce, you mentioned if China slows down 1%, the world slows down 0.5%. Latin America, it's 1 to 1. I know China has a closed capital account largely. There's some ways you have direct investment portfolio, but you have to pass go. You have to stop for a while. So there's some kinds of restrictions still. So give us a very brief primer on the mechanisms by which China's overall shift structurally or cyclically go out to the rest of the global economy through, is it through financial markets and interest rates? Is it through, less demand for new housing in Shanghai means less demand for copper, which means less investment in mining elsewhere? Or, Scott Roselle mentioned the higher wages in China lately. How does the Chinese economy's trajectory get fed into the rest and then gets you to that effect on the rest of the world?
No, well, thanks for that question, Scott, and from the audience as well. So first of all, I don't think that it's necessarily like the bond and the equity, the portfolio flows that cause the contagion. You still have that foreign ownership of China's government bond market, of the equity market is still like low single digits. 3 to 4% of the market. So I don't think it's so much the financial market contagion. And as I mentioned, I don't see Evergrande as being systemic. It's really the China demand story. And we can see that with commodities, where the measures that have been put into place are part of this rationing process as China goes towards decarbonization. But you can see the effect that that's taken on commodities. But it's about China's consumption. And I fully agree with John that the U.S. companies are sort of committed to China. We think that China will actually reach the same size of the U.S. economy before the end of the decade. So it's the access to that market still that's very important for all multinational businesses. And the pandemic really did change this, with China being the only country that had positive growth last year, with north of 8% growth this year. We think it accelerated the timetable for China to reach the same size of the U.S. economy by 2 to 3 years just from this pandemic. So I think that the linkages that are the most important are really that China demand story, because so much of the world has depended on that. And I think the other piece of it is the supply chain. What we have seen is that these supply chain bottlenecks have stayed in place longer than expected. So everybody said this was transitory, it's going to revert back, but we haven't seen that happen as easily. I mean, the truth is we're in a less open world right now. There are more deglobalization forces that are at work. So when we look at things like inventories being at a 25-year low, a lot of that is linked to the Asia story and specifically to the China story. So I look at the contagion points much more as being related to supply chain, also to China demand. Now, I don't think that common prosperity is over, and there's really 3 channels that the Chinese are trying to achieve common prosperity. The first is market outcomes. But I think they've decided that market outcomes alone are not going to do this. The second we've talked about, and Scott and John have both talked about this, it's taxes and transfers. But the third part that they've laid out for common prosperity targets is what I'd call tertiary targets, like charity, voluntary, community-based, which we haven't seen yet. So I think this is something where there are still other policies that are going to be rolled out, and there's also a very long-term time frame to basically make progress. The way it's worded, make progress on these goals by 2035 and to achieve these goals by 2049. So I don't think that this is over, and I think that a lot of this, like how should the U.S. and China behave? Can you really decouple? And technological decoupling is costly, and is that even really possible? These are issues, Scott, that you and I have talked about for many years right now. But I think that on both sides, you have just the decoupling is not going to be that possible, just given what the global linkages are.
Yeah. That's really extremely important points to make, and I do think there's a lot of stuff going on in Washington trying to understand that. Although we may, and I think we're going to see in the coming weeks and months Washington's own, sort of new policy initiatives. But I don't think we can hold a candle to China's. Before you were running through that list of policies, the word manic came into my head, and I was thinking of the manic phase of the Cultural Revolution. And Washington, we're still gripped by, it's still gridlock. So, Scott, from your perspective, China's, part of this is, nationalism, as John said, self-reliance. You mentioned education, banning, nighttime schools, etc. What does this broader change in China's political trajectory under Xi Jinping mean? Is this going to? I have a hard time seeing how a more closed, politically tight China gets more growth and more equitable growth. Are you a glass half full on this? Glass 3/4 empty? Dirty water?
Yeah, I really have trouble seeing where the growth comes out of this, and I think that rural revitalization, right, or rural vitalization. I mean, we're going to move all the farmers back to the farms. Obviously, there's no growth out there, right? The other, it's dual circulation economy, and we're going to move. I often say, they want to make getting our urban hukou easier, but what they mean is they want to move 200 million, 20,000 people to 2,000 third and fourth and fifth tier cities, right? In other words, they want 400 million people to move into, I always call it, they want to make 2,000 Cincinnatis, right? They want to have a country that's populated, and of course, the 350 million, middle class and upper middle class, they live in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, right? Who's going to populate these, 2,000 Cincinnatis? It's going to be people low income, right? And if the middle income people aren't consuming, what do low income people consume, right? I mean, they aren't going to be consuming services. And in these fourth and fifth tier cities, there's going to be no manufacturing and very little construction. So I just don't understand where this growth is going to come from. And, Marty White, I have to say, Marty White from Harvard tracked, the happiness of China in this country full of inequality. And even though people understand that they're in the bottom tercile, bottom quartile of this, bottom medium of this country, they've got better over time. But as soon as you start to get worse over time, all of it changes, right? So if the growth does slow down, which I think that, like we say, both the speakers have said, if growth slows down, the bottom half of this economy is going to look forward and say, I don't see myself getting better. I see the end of the China dream coming. Then, oh my gosh, all bets are off. People start to act very, very different than they do now. So I think we're a long ways off, and I don't see in this new economic plan that they have where the growth comes from.
Well,
Scott, could I?
Go ahead.
I just want to jump in a little bit on this, because one of the problems in understanding China is just parsing the contradictory messages that are coming out. On the one hand, China wants to be self-reliant. You had China 2025. The dual circulation seems to want the world to be dependent on China without China's dependency on the world. And a lot of that stuff, when you think about it, just doesn't make sense for China. This country, it needs its export industries to power employment. This is a big deal for China. It may not be exports may not be a massive percentage of China's GDP, but it surely employs a lot of people and they get paid. So, China right now, the power crisis, would it be better if they were still importing coal from Australia, for example? And I kind of wonder if there isn't going to be a shift within the party to have a deeper recognition of the reliance and the inevitable reliance of China on the rest of the world, and to get away from some of this autarkic thinking that I think is infecting some policy making. And if that's the case, then we may see the opportunities for better discussions and conversations with other countries, including our own.
Well, you're exactly where I wanted to go with this. So great minds think alike. And I think if you took the sentences that you just said, John, and you switched the words US and China in most of those sentences, you'd be talking about the conversation we're having in Washington. Should we be dependent on China? Should we be self-reliant? Should we bring all the supply chains home? It's similar conversations around coffee tables, slightly different shapes. So which is where we now need to go, since CSIS is a Washington D.C. think tank, and we've got to speak to the policy community. So you're in the NSC, the State Department, Commerce, Treasury, et cetera. You're looking at China's effort towards common prosperity in all of its glory and complexity. Does the U.S. learn from this? Geez, China's gonna get it right. They're gonna be more formidable. 2035, 2049. We really need to up our game. Or is it, geez, this is really actually not going to fix problems. It may actually make things worse. It may get to the word that I didn't use that was hidden in Scott Rosel's point in referring to Marty White's book, The Social Volcano. That's going to occur. What's the lesson that Washington policymakers should take away from this? Each of you, what would you say for them is the big takeaway message in terms of where China's going, or what the U.S. should do in response? Maybe we'll start with John, and then Joyce and Scott.
Yeah, Scott, it's a great question. You teed it up very nicely, and we the Commerce Secretary is saying decoupling is impractical. It's not in our interest. It's not in China's interest, and I think we need to have some consensus on that across the aisle. Secondly, we do have security issues. We have security problems that we need to pay attention to. So build high walls around a small garden to keep technological advantages where we need them. And be prepared to work with China wherever possible. China, if it's massively successful, well, depends what you mean by success. If it includes an evolution socially and economically that we think is favorable to us, well, that's great. If China's a failure, that's a disaster for the world also. So that doesn't, we would like China to be successful, and we want to work with them to make that success one that's compatible with us and everybody else.
Yeah. Joyce?
No, let me just add to John's points that I think that one thing that has concerned me is that the technocrats seem to be with a more diminished role in China and also in the U.S. in this discussion. It's become much more of a national security discussion. And I do worry that you want to have that economic dialogue, the technocratic dialogue back into place. And I am more skeptical that you can actually achieve technological decoupling. I think the market will turn its attention to some of these bills that are getting discussed in the Congress after infrastructure and the social spending, the budget reconciliation, because there are a number of bills about technological development and self-sufficiency for the U.S. So I think a lot of this rhetoric is going to come back. But what worries me when I look at the state of dialogue is that just given the rhetoric that's being used, and as you said, that both sides, it's very similar rhetoric. It's about addressing inequality. It's more nationalistic. It's about talking about self-reliance. What worries me is the language that's being used right now really doesn't provide an off-ramp And I think you need to have those technocrats sort of included as part of the discussion. And even when we talk about sanctions and some of these measures, the majority of the trade between the U.S. and China on the manufacturing side, it isn't these national security interests. That could be of the 650 billion, several billion of it, but not the vast majority of it. So I think it's very important to have a dialogue that does continue rather than each side sort of playing for the domestic audiences, and bringing the technocrats back together in that dialogue. I hope that is something that can still be achieved in this environment where I think post-pandemic there has been a real rise in nationalism around the globe.
Yeah. Scott Rozelle, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to add a little bit. This is a little out of the area of a development economist that squats in rural villages. But building on what both of John and Joyce just said, my feeling is if growth does slow, and if it doesn't matter if it's because of conflict with the U.S. or because of faltering supply chains or because of whatever, I think that's going to accelerate this polarization inside China. There's going to be a real legitimacy problem at home, and if we were really lucky when the Soviet Union sort of faltered and we had Gorbachev in place. But I think that what we'd see is a turn to nationalism. If growth faltered, stopped, if there was a rise of crime, if there was a rise of even a thinking that a lack of confidence in the party and in the government, and I don't think there's many good outcomes from that. And I think that's why we are in this together, and it's just what John said, right? We can't break these supply chains. Our own self-sufficiency isn't going to drive our growth forward. I think we need to figure out how to do it. It's not all in like it used to be, but I liked how John put that. Manage this right, and let's keep going.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask a question. Maybe it comes out of left field a little bit for you all, but I'm sitting in Washington D.C. in my office. Joyce is at her home. We're all at home, and we're not on planes. We're not on the ground in China. We're not getting jet lag. If we wanted to understand common prosperity or some other big thing that's going on in China, things that you work on, that your students, Scott, want to know about, or John, your clients, or Joyce, the folks that put their trust in JP Morgan, and you got a chance to go to China and do one thing, where would you go? What would you want to try to learn that is much harder from the seat that you're currently sitting in? Professor Rozelle, if you had a chance, what would be the first thing that you'd want to learn that we can't? What's that X factor that this discussion would be better helped to resolve if we could travel?
So like I said, I spend my time in villages and in rural towns, and we go into households. We're doing our work on early childhood development and on health and on education. But along the way, our friends in China, our rural Chinese friends, they're so honest with us. They tell us what they're thinking, and the 35 years I was working in China, it was always, gosh, I see a better life ahead of me, right? The last 3 or 4 years, you get these young men coming back, and you've never seen a young man in a village, right? Because he's always out working, and he's saying, I just can't find a job. I don't know what I'm going to do. And we're missing the voice of the Chinese people. You know, I'm talking to, you know, the rural half of the population, which is, you know, 72% of the population right now. But, you know, I think that that's what we're missing. And, you know, and I think that it goes both ways. You know, we see on the news that everybody's happy, and I think there are, but I think that there are segments that they're starting to reflect concerns or to be happy about things, either way. So I think that that's what we need to do, is get out and just talk to, you know, the masses, and see how that interacts with the data we're getting and the analysis that we're giving.
John, you mentioned the 5-volume set that placed in your hotel room. Are you looking for a different type of book placed, or what would you want to learn most about?
I do two things. I'd love to go spend some time hanging out with my buddies at Peking University, where I spent 3.5 years, faculty and students. And I'd love to go back to Qihe County, just outside of Jinan in Shandong, where Cargill built its first investment there in 1988. I'd like to go back and talk to folks. That's what I do.
Well, Joyce?
So as I mentioned, I hope they really do keep the technocratic dialogue going, and I think, as John said, that between academia, and between just technocrats, there used to be just a dialogue that really wasn't as tinged as much with nationalism and with populism, and it seems like some of that dialogue has gone by the wayside. Other things we've tried to do is we've done these virtual road shows just to try to see what's going on the ground more clearly, since we can't do the in-person visits. But the final thing I would say is just that, everybody should be reading, the Communist Party, statements very carefully, because they really do allude to all of this. So, common prosperity was actually quite well outlined in 2017 in the 19th Party Congress. And, China very rarely, presents a problem without also having the solution. So I would just say, go back and very carefully read what's coming out of the party statements. I also hope that the academic dialogue and the technocratic dialogue is something that can sort of be separated away from some of these more nationalistic, populist forums. And I think that, we've had to rely much more on how we can virtually see what's going on in China and see where the mobility is at.
That's helpful. Good answers from all of you. And the next time I go to China, I want 4 of us to go, and we're going to go to each of your favorite places, and we will come back with a relatively comprehensive understanding, because we will touch the 4 corners of the country. But in the meantime, I really take Joyce's guidance to heart. We can read, we can watch, we can learn, and you all have helped us learn a lot. You're fantastic China watchers, whether you're on the ground in China or you're in the United States trying to help us understand things. So I want to thank Joyce, Scott, and John for being with us today. My CSIS team in the trustee chair and the broadcast team for bringing this to everybody, for audience members for listening, for offering good questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but this is an ongoing issue. We will be coming back to this many, many times. Thank everybody for joining. Hope you have a good day, evening, wherever you are. Take care. Cheers.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you,
Scott.
Thank you, Scott.